Good morning, Middletown South. How are you on this fine Tuesday morning? Welcome back to another episode of Mr. Mullans Minutes in History.
You're traveling to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound.
This episode, Imperialism and America.
Land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
So, what is imperialism? Imperialism is the policy of extending control over weaker nations. Emphasis on extending your control and weaker nations. Beginning in 1867 and continuing through the century, global competition causes the United States to expand, especially to places like South America, Asia, and Africa. It became a race to gain China. However, once some nations noticed the other nations getting involved, conflicts arose.
A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination.
Which is one of the reasons the desire for military strength was popular back in the U.S. Admiral Alfred T. Mahan urged the U.S. government to build up a navy, and once we do, we became the third largest naval power on Earth. Another reason for American expansionism was the thirst for new markets. U.S. farms and factories were producing more than Americans at home could consume. So we opened up foreign trade, which became a solution to overproduction, and in return for getting rid of our surplus items that we made at home, we also received surplus items from other nations, giving us raw materials to make more items, giving us more money when we traded it in foreign places. Therefore, also helping the economy. Around this time, we were also considering purchasing Alaska. Well, U.S. William Seward, Secretary of State at the time, was having trouble convincing the House to purchase Alaska. However, in 1867, the House arranged the purchase of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. They called Alaska Seward's Icebox, or Seward's Folly, because they didn't see any opportunity in a land of literally just ice and snow. There, they find Alaska is actually rich in timber, minerals, and oil. Lucky Mr. Seward, huh? Not only were we busy purchasing Alaska, we were also working on Hawaii. Since the 1790s, U.S. merchants stopped in Hawaii on the way to China or India to refuel. In the 1820s, Yankee missionaries founded schools and churches on the island. And by the mid-1800s, American-owned sugar plantations were 75% of the island's wealth. In 1887, the U.S. pressured Hawaii to allow a naval base at Pearl Harbor, which becomes a huge refueling station for the USA. In 1890, McKinley Tariff eliminates duty-free status of Hawaiian sugar. Planters call for U.S. to annex islands so it will not have to pay duty taxes. In 1887, businessmen forced, sorry for butchering the name, King Kalakaua to limit vote to landowners. Queen, again, sorry for butchering the name, Liliuokalani, tries to remove landowning requirement. With the help of U.S. Marines, business groups overthrow the Queen. They set up a government headed by Sanford B. Dole. President Cleveland cannot make Dole surrender power back to the Queen, so he's forced to recognize it as the Republic of Hawaii. And under President McKinley, Congress proclaims Hawaii U.S. territory. In 1898, the United States goes to war to help Cuba win its independence from Spain. Cuba, at the time, had been under Spain's control. Eventually, Cuba decided they wanted to rebel against being under Spain's control. America sympathized with Cuba and decided that we would help them out, being as we saw interest in Cuba. By the Second War, led by Jose Marti, led a second revolution in 1895, and their guerrilla campaign destroyed American-owned sugar mills and plantations. This left the American opinion split. Businesses wanted to support Spain while others favored the Cuban cause. Right about now, war fever was escalating. In 1896, General Valeriano Weyler was sent to Cuba to restore order. And he put about 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps. This made the headline on every newspaper in America. Newspapers exploited Weyler's action in circulation war, using yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is sensational writing used to lure and enrage readers. So let's think of Spain's actions as a tension bar. Every little thing they did, as it was reported in America, rose on the tension bar. The Delhomme de Letter was something that brought the tension bar up relatively high. The headlines in the newspaper in America increased American sympathy for an independent Cuba. McKinley wanted to avoid war and tries diplomacy to resolve the crisis, when a private letter by the Spanish minister Enrique Dupuy de Lome was published, which in it called President McKinley weak, and it swayed the public. Spain apologized and de Lome resigned. American public was still angry though. However, the USS Maine is what really brought the tension bar up. The USS Maine was sent to pick up some US citizens from Cuba and to protect US property. The ship blew up in the Havana harbor and the newspapers blamed Spain. It turns out Spain didn't actually do it, but the fact that the newspapers were saying that they did really brought American people to declare war, which meant that the US kind of had to declare war. The War in the Philippines. The First Battle of Spain occurred in the Spanish colony of the Philippines. The War in the Philippines. The First Battle of Spain occurred in the Spanish colony of the Philippines. Commodore George Dewey destroys the Spanish fleet in the Manila harbor. Filipinos, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, support Dewey. August 1898, Spanish troops in Manila surrender to U.S. All the while, the Rough Riders, led by Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt, led a volunteer cavalry. Roosevelt declared hero of attack on strategic San Juan Hill. The Treaty of Paris. Spain and the U.S. signed armistice August 1898 and meet in Paris to make a treaty. Spain frees Cuba, hands Guam and Puerto Rico to the U.S., and sells us the Philippines. However, there was debating over the treaty. The Treaty of Paris touched a great debate over imperialism. McKinley tried to justify annexation of the Philippines on moral grounds, while the opponents give political, moral, and economic arguments against it. The War in the Caribbean. The U.S. blockades Cuba. Spanish fleet in Santiago de Cuba harbor. Unlike the Navy, U.S. Army has a small professional force with many volunteers. Volunteers were ill-prepared and ill-supplied, but still. Ruling Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was under military rule. During the Spanish-American War, General Nelson A. Miles occupies the island. Puerto Rico was under our military control. People split on independence, statehood, self-government under the U.S. Puerto Rico strategic as post in the Caribbean for protection of future canal. In 1900, the Four-Acre Act sets up a civil government. The Platt Amendment. U.S. makes Cuba add Platt Amendment to his 1901 Constitution. The Platt Amendment does not allow Cuba to go into debt, but it also stipulates no treaties that let foreign power control the land. The U.S. has the right to intervene, and the U.S. can buy or lease land for Navy. Occupies some of Cuba and has the same officials in office as Spain. Cuban protesters were imprisoned or exiled, meaning they were also sent into almost what's like a concentration camp, which is exactly what we kicked out Spain for. Vocab word. Outside of America, the U.S. sees interest in China. The U.S. saw China as a vast and potential market and an investment opportunity. France, Britain, Japan, and Russia also saw it as that, which is why they had settlements and spheres of influence. John Hay's Open Door Notes. U.S. Secretary of State John Hay issues Open Door Notes. Notes ask imperialist nations to share trading rights with the U.S. Other powers reluctantly agree. Reluctantly is the key word here. The Chinese were not exactly happy about this whole thing, so they start the Boxer Rebellion. Europeans dominated most of the large Chinese cities, so the Chinese formed secret societies, including Boxers, meaning people who boxed up products, to expel the foreigners. The Boxers killed hundreds of foreigners. US, Britain, France, Germany, and Japan all put down the Boxer Rebellion. Hay issues new open door notes saying the U.S. will keep trading open. Open door policy reflects beliefs about the U.S. economy. Growth depends on exports. The Anti-Imperialist League. McKinley's re-election confirms that most Americans favor imperialism. The Anti-Imperialist League has prominent people from different fields. For various reasons, they agree that it's wrong to rule others without their consent. After Madero overthrows Diaz, General Victoriano Huerta takes over the government, and Madero is murdered. President Wilson back in the U.S. refuses to recognize Huerta's government. Obviously, Huerta isn't very happy about this, so he realizes there are U.S. sailors in Mexico. And he arrests the U.S. sailors. Quickly realizing his mistake in messing with the U.S. sailors, he releases them. Eventually, the Huerta regime falls, and nationalist Carranza is the new president. Rebellion in Mexico. Francisco Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, both oppose Carranza. Zapata wants land reform, and Villa is a fierce nationalist. President Wilson recognizes Carranza's government, and Villa threatens reprisals. Villa's men then kill Americans. This was a big mistake, because then we send someone named John J. Pershing to capture Villa. All the while, Carranza demands withdrawal of the U.S. troops, and President Wilson refuses at first. But all the while, the U.S. is also facing war in Europe, so they make peace on their southern border. Because it's kind of hard to be fighting two wars at the same time. Wilson orders Pershing home, and Mexico adopts a new constitution. The government controls oil and minerals and restricts foreign investors. Restricts foreign investors. By 1920, Alvaro Obregón is the new president and ends the Civil War and starts a reform. Thanks for watching, and this was another episode of Mr. Mullans Minutes in History.
You're traveling to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone. You're traveling to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone. You're traveling to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop,